about, and that is a breaking news story, the Maxwell Trial. So, for those of you who don't know, Maxwell was the assistant of Epstein. Epstein was put in jail for basically charges of trafficking, sex with minors, child trafficking, and his engagement in that type of activity. Now, he was a very wealthy billionaire and had his own private island where he would take people, and he committed suicide in jail. Some people think he was killed in order to keep him from giving up the names of other people who were involved in this. So the trial that is going on now is the trial of his assistant, Maxwell, a woman who is accused of basically bringing him these young girls, these minors, grooming them, right? And so what I want to look at is what are the main violations of these principles that are happening in this case. Now, of course, I cannot speak to the legal outcome of this case. That is going to be based on what the court decides, precedent. They haven't really done trials of enablers of sexual abuse to set legal precedent for this, but I want to talk it through based on the principles to say what were the violations in this situation based on the testimony of the facts that we have that's in the news, okay? Because I don't, of course, know all the details. I'm just speaking to some of the circumstances that they discussed and circumstances like this, all right? So how much is somebody who is an enabler liable for the violations that happen? And this is very common, actually, to have women as enablers for traffickers, for sex traffickers, for child abusers. It's very common to have women as the front men or the front woman, let's say, because people are more likely to trust them, right? Especially children and young women are more likely to trust them. And so this is something we really do need to look at. Now, this in this framework, I'd say there's three major violations that occur in this type of scenario, right? So in this type of scenario, there's a difference between if Maxwell was engaging in sexual relations with young women who were actually underage, right? Like 15, 16, 17, they were under the statutory limit. And in some cases, maybe they weren't under the statutory limit. Maybe they were like just barely 18, or, they were still very young, impressionable young women. So is there still a violation going on in that case, right? So let's talk about that. So as the news has described this story, basically what would happen is Maxwell and Epstein would go to maybe events, charities, summer camp programs of things like this, and they would identify a young girl, oftentimes underage, usually from a poor family struggling. Maybe her parents had cancer, or she had lost a member of her family, and they would identify this vulnerable individual, begin to shower her with favor, take her out, take her family out, and then say, okay, we're going to help you, we're going to support you. They'd give her scholarships to a program, or they'd put her family into, maybe their family was going to lose their housing because of they didn't have any money. They would put her mother into a apartment or a home, right? They would do things to take care of and groom this young woman. And then, but at the same point, they were trying to normalize sexual behavior around the girl to help her feel like, okay, well, this is normal, right? And to gain her trust. And then they would put her in situations where Epstein would abuse the girl, have sex with her, etc. So this, from the testimony, this seems to be the pattern of what was happening. Now, where are the violations occurring in this type of scenario? Okay. First of all, we want to talk about, how much how much responsibility does someone like Maxwell have? She's the enabler, right? She's enabling a criminal activity. She is helping it out. Okay, maybe although there are some descriptions of orgies or things in which Maxwell actually did participate sexually in those situations with the young girl as well, in conjunction with Epstein. Even without that, right? Even if she was just grooming the young women and bringing the young women to him, knowing that he was going to sexually molest them, right? This is that outer ring. When we're talking about how much responsibility do you bear if you are a contributor to a violation of somebody else, knowing that they are going to violate someone, right? Obviously, that ring is where we define a lot of tort law, where you actually contribute to that violation, right? There's also aspects in criminal law like conspiracy. There's other theories where we say, okay, this person is going to be liable for what they have done in this situation. Now, I'm not going to get into the criminal to legal aspect side. Let's just look at the principles of what this violation is, what violation is happening here. Okay, these are principles of fraud and principles of blackmail. These are some of the main principles that are being violated here, and this is in the relationship or the deal aspect. Okay, of course, anytime someone gets pressured into turning over their body or having sex in a situation where they don't really want to, that is rape. All right, if they feel coerced, pressured into the situation for fear of punishment, for fear that something bad is going to happen to their family, right, or something bad will happen to them, that is rape. That's already there. That's when they don't have to be underage, right? You do not have to be underage for coercive, being placed in a coercive sexual situation for that to be rape. So even for the girls that were not underage, that were threatened, that is still rape, okay? Where they were threatened or their families were threatened if they didn't engage or go through with this. So let's talk about the situation, like some of these situations. What is the violation that's happening? One is power disparity, okay? Anytime, this is one thing I talk about, anytime there is a power disparity, you create the circumstances for abuse. Doesn't always mean that abuse will occur, but those circumstances are ripe for abuse. So what do you think is the power disparity between some very young, ignorant, fresh girl who's, maybe 16, and a grown man like Epstein, a very sophisticated person, very powerful, a lot of money, a lot of powerful friends that he throws around their names? What kind of a power disparity do you think is happening there? Do you think that's going to feel like pressure on that young, innocent girl who probably hasn't been taught to stand up for herself, right? Who has no backup, usually very poor, right? Nothing to give her like a way to move forward in life. Anytime you're in a situation like that, that kind of man can feel very threatening. They can be very persuasive, right? But anytime you're in a power disparity like that, if the person with greater power is applying pressure, already that pressure is magnified because of the power disparity, right? So is there a way to interact in a relationship, say between a boss and an employee, that is not abuse? You'd have to be very, very careful and really walk through the principles of it in such a way that it is possible that they could engage in it without it being abusive. But the germination, the conditions for abuse are so strong, you have to be extra careful. Now we're talking about a situation where this is a very powerful man, used to getting his way, and very young teenage girls, right? Already that's going to be a situation of abuse, right? That's already going to be a high likelihood that any sexual interaction between them is going to be abusive. Now, anytime the young girl is underage, obviously that's already a criminal activity, and that's what was going on. This guy was having sex with underage girls. That's already criminal activity. That's called statutory rape, right? So first of all, if she was bringing him these young girls And, she would bring them in, she would, have them undressed, she would have them give him a massage, tell them to do whatever he wanted, right? So obviously she was setting them up for rape. So she was contributing to the crime, right? In that sense. Now let's look at it from another sense. Let's look at it and say, okay, there's another aspect to this, which is fraud. So how would they set this up? How would they set up the scenario where this young girl is feeling pressured into doing this? They would offer her, right? First, when they would bring her into the situation, they would be telling her, oh, you're so wonderful, you're so talented, we're going to give you this scholarship, we're going to, help you find help your family find a place to live, right? They would offer her all of these things. And then they would sneak it in at the back end after making her all these promises and giving her all this stuff. Then they would be like, okay, now you just need to go do this. Now you just need to go have sex with this guy, right? So this is something that we could call fraud in the inducement, okay? It says, I really wish young girls in my country can see your live. It's very important to know more about every single situation. Yes, 100%. This is why I'm doing these lives. And hopefully they can see them because it's on the internet, so you can share it with them. So we have fraud in the inducement. This happens a lot in situations where someone is subjected to sexual harassment in the workplace, okay? Where you sign up, you walk into the work, right? They have a list. These are your job. This is what we're going to pay you for. You're going to be a secretary. You're going to type. You're going to do emails. You're going to do this and that and the other. You say, okay, great. You're going to pay me this much money. I'm going to do these tasks. That was the agreement. Then after you join, right? After you get the job, you're depending on it for your income to feed your family, to feed your children. Then the boss tries to come in and say, hey, I want these sexual favors from you. And if you don't do it, I'm going to fire you. Okay. So those parameters have nothing to do with you doing your job, right? That's sexual harassment. That's sexual abuse. They were not presented up front. It's a totally different situation if, let's say, a woman goes to apply for a job to be a stripper. Okay. Now, we can have a debate as to, the objectification of women and all of this sort of stuff. But in the scenario where a woman goes to apply to a job to be a stripper, she knows that part of the contract of that job is taking off her clothes on the stage for men, not necessarily being touched by anyone, right? And usually they have very clear parameters of what clients are allowed to do and not. They have bouncers there that are there to stop clients from touching and so on, right? It's a very clear description of what is allowed or is not allowed. But when the woman signs up for that, she understands that is the job, right? That is the agreement, right? Whether you think it's right or wrong, at least she walks into that job knowing exactly what is expected, okay? That's different. That's an agreement for her versus someone who signs up to be a secretary and then is being told by the boss, I want you to take your clothes off, or I want you to perform some sexual act afterwards, after that job, after she's gotten that job, right? And that has nothing to do with that job and nothing to do with anything that she would have wished for, wanted, or, signed up for willingly, knowing this ahead of time. Okay. So this is already a violation of the agreement. This is a violation of the contract, right? So if the boss knew that he was going to demand that from his employees, then you have to put that in the contract. Okay. No boss is going to do that, right? Because that's absolutely ridiculous. But that becomes, in that case, that's fraud, right? It's also sexual harassment, which is also a crime, right? And blackmail, right? So in that case, that's called undue pressure or blackmail, saying now you have this job, you're supporting your family with it. If you don't perform the sexual act with me, then I'm going to fire you, right? You're going to lose your job. That is applying undue pressure. This is called. And when we apply undue pressure in a contractual relationship or an exchange relationship, that is called blackmail. So that was one of the things that Epstein was doing to these young girls, where he was promising them stuff, giving them scholarships, helping them get into colleges or get into education, and maybe helping their parents have a place to stay. and then blackmailing them afterwards and saying, if you don't have sex with me or you don't continue to maintain a sexual relationship with me when they didn't want to do that, they would be threatened that they would lose these things, lose these privileges, or their parents would lose the housing that they were in, right? So right off the bat, what is that? That is a violation. That is called undue pressure, and that is, we would call that blackmail, okay? So those are some of the main, I guess, areas that this is, you know, that this is these are some of the main violations, I would say, right? So when we have fraud, where you're like fraud in the inducement, where they don't give them all the terms of what they want in return for what they're offering up front, right? Obviously, you know, the first crime is just having sex with underage minors, which is already a crime, right? But even for the ones that maybe were 18, right? You still have that situation where they're lying and they've got fraud in the inducement. So, the next one is undue pressure, which becomes blackmail, right? So that is both in a situation like I described where they would give them all of these things, and then once they were dependent on them, once they became dependent in their life on them, then they would go in and threaten to remove them if they didn't engage in sexual activity, right? So that's undue pressure. That's blackmail after the fact. The other aspect is when you have the power disparity between a young, vulnerable teenage girl and a very sophisticated, elderly, powerful, wealthy man who is incredibly manipulative and uses all of these manipulation techniques, like I said, fraud, blackmail, lies, etc., at his disposal, right? And so these are all the different ways in which these violations were occurring. And for this woman, Maxwell, to be facilitating this, right? So she was facilitating this. She was complicit in the fraud, in the lies, in creating the environment, in gaining these young girls' trust, right? And then knowing what was going to happen to them, knowing that they were going to be applying blackmail and these other types of pressure to these young girls, knowing that these young girls were going to be put in situations where they would be pressured into having sex. So one of the things that happens with a young girl, and this happened with, right, so this with Epstein, with Harvey Weinstein, right, all of these guys, you have these young, vulnerable girls in a situation with a very powerful man, somebody maybe that they respect, they admire, or maybe even need to help them in their career. And these young girls don't really know like how to stand up for themselves, their body. And so they get put in a situation where they're alone in a room with one of these guys, and these guys, maybe they strip off their clothes, they take the girl, they force them to commit an act, and the young girl is just kind of frozen. She doesn't know what to do. She's never been in this situation before. She's scared. She doesn't know how to stand up for herself, how to say anything back. And typically, it's in a situation where she feels very cowed or scared by this person. And that's on purpose. That's on purpose. They've created a situation in which that young girl is going to be very intimidated and not feel like she is comfortable to say no or to speak up for herself, right? This is why we want to make sure we get this type of training into schools, teaching young women about their rights, their power in their body, their power to say no. But young women, just by nature, already feel very vulnerable about themselves, about their sexuality, and just in general, you know, I talk about this in my book about how we train up our young women to always like be nice and be sweet, and all of this sort of stuff makes them actually more susceptible to these type of violations and makes them less able to stand up for themselves in these type of situations. So we really want to watch that in how we train our young women. But those are some of the main things, like principles, violations that I can see that's going on in a situation like this. And I would say 100% Maxwell is liable according to these principles, right? Because she was engaging in these acts knowing that this was going to happen, which is the layer of the effect, right? So she is responsible. for this. And I saw this even in my own life because, like, in the cult that I grew up with, right? And you read some of the stories in my book, right? There's this one story in particular where I'm talking about how this woman in the home where I was a teenager, this woman who was a leader in the home basically pressured or forced me into having sex with a young man that I didn't want to have sex with. And I said I didn't want to, but the idea was that if I didn't have sex with him, then I was being unyielded to God and I would be punished. Okay. And it was a woman that was forcing me into this situation. So women definitely do it to other women and young girls, and they're definitely liable for this. Another situation that I saw that I talk about in the book too is in the situation of my grandfather, his second wife, Maria, right? Who she actually very strongly encouraged my grandfather's perversions, including bringing him young girls and being in the room with him. She would bring him young women. And I describe a situation like this in the book. She would bring in the young women. She would sit and watch while they, had sexual activity and stuff. So she was the one that was very strongly enabling and assisting my grandfather to engage in these perversions. And she was a much younger woman. She was about half his age. She was the age of his children, right? When they got together and they got married. All right. So sadly, it happens a lot where there you have a man empowered, right? So my grandfather was a guru. He was a leader. He was considered, a prophet in this cult. And you have a woman who is enabling that person, and they hold on to their power by catering to that strong male's every wish, whim, and perversion. And so we see this a lot. I just described 2 instances that I know of in my personal family where this happened. So definitely these women are responsible. They are responsible for their actions. They are responsible for the violations that they contributed to of these young girls. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. I hope you found that interesting. It's the first time I've really done this, breaking down sort of a current events topic and saying what are the principles that are being violated in this situation and how can we spot what those are. So I hope that that's helpful for all of you guys, and that you can kind of carry that with you as you look at news stories and look at situations of these things that are happening that help you to spot where the violations are taking place, even beyond just like when they talk of the legal argument or whatever that is, right? You can understand the principles of the violations. And just by understanding these simple 4 rings here, right? Thank you. She says, I did really. Thank you very much. Good. I'm so glad that that was helpful for you. And share it with your loved ones, share it with other women, share it with your classes, right? Make sure you get this information out as much as possible to people. So I hope you guys all have a beautiful day, and I will talk to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye.